I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to what may be the conclusion of the Storming America series. This is episode 43, Storming America, the Aftermath. Who knows what this portends for the future. Maybe I'll revisit this very topic sometime if more stuff starts to coalesce or I come up with other thoughts to add to this. A little bit of housekeeping. Please follow me at Twitter at @WBupert. Please go to my Substack. Would love to see comments to both my dispatches, which are the essays that I write in the fortnightly interregnum between my fortnightly issuance and cadence of the podcast for Chasing Ghosts and Irregular Warfare podcast series. So I'd love to hear from you guys. I did get out of step slightly with my dispatches, my essays, because I had my youngest son, my dearly beloved youngest son, visiting with me. We had a great time, along with he and his wife, and then another son visited me the very same week after. So that was great. That's why that happened. I pride myself on my punctuality and attendance to rituals, so I take it as a personal affront that I missed a week in the issuance of said essay. So what I've done is I've issued an essay this weekend, which presages the Monday issuance of this very podcast that you'll be hearing this morning on your favorite podcast provider, whichever one you listen to, whether it be Spotify, Amazon, Apple, whatever the case may be. And you will find it will be about my notions on Memorial Day, which are much more cynical and dark than most people who either celebrate or observe that day, whatever kind of notions you have about that. I offer mine. I caution you, if you read that essay, it will leave you in a darker mood after you finish it. That being the case, I thought before we get into the meat of this podcast that it being the weekend of Memorial Day, that I read from one of my favorite, and again, a dark book on the subject of My Lai by Howard Jones, Vietnam, 1968, and the Descent into Darkness. I've read several books on My Lai. I consider this to be the standard by which all the others are judged, because not only does he do a very thorough primary source and secondary source documentation overview of the events in 1968, of the aftermath in 1968, resonating into these very contemporary times now in the 21st century when it comes to warfare. I wanted to read a couple excerpts there that I think ring true not only for 1968, but the thousands of years that presage that, and all the years that we live in now in these dark times. Quote, My Lai was a turning point for so many reasons, not least for the ways in which it tarnished the image many Americans had of their soldiers, and that the soldiers had of themselves. Veterans came home expecting to receive a warm welcome, but instead encountered widespread and vicious criticism of their actions in Vietnam. More than a few veterans felt that Calley, Lieutenant Calley, who had been involved in the incident where a platoon of American soldiers slaughtered men, women, and children in a Vietnamese village in 1968, again in the quote, had cast a dark shadow over the military. Perhaps the most outspoken critic was Harry G. Summers, a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, veteran of Korean and Vietnam Wars, and best-selling author of books on military strategy. At a 1994 conference on My Lai at Tulane University, he told the audience, Calley and Medina ought to have been hung and then drawn and quartered, and the remains put at the gates at Fort Benning to remind all who entered of the consequences. The bastard fell through the cracks. In a television interview, Colonel David Hackworth, agreed with this position. Calley should have been lined up against the wall and shot. The guy's a murderer. Only crime And the criminal remarked, Hannah Arendt, she was the author of On Totalitarianism, confront us with the perplexity of radical evil, but only the hypocrite is really rotten at the core. Both Scheel and Simpson came to realize what they had done, felt intense guilt, expressed remorse, and in their way, atoned. Callie had provided no indication of any of these changes in attitude and will likely take his reasons and his feelings to his grave. In the mid-1990s, Tim O'Brien publicly declared at the same Tulane conference attended by Summers that military authorities today should prosecute both the perpetrators of the war crimes at My Lai and those who covered them up. Callie should have remained in jail all of his life. He was no scapegoat. He committed the crimes, as did the others in Charlie Company, who followed his orders and, like him, publicly admitted to the killings. O'Brien's comment echoed with Lieutenant General Peers had said 15 years earlier, quote, there is no statute of limitations for war crimes, end of quote. Now, nothing today could ease the pain of what happened at My Lai, but it is crucial that we do not allow this tragedy to slip from memory. Two instances out of many remind us of the importance of remembering how the events of that day had a lasting, deeply personal impact on both Americans and Vietnamese. Varnado Simpson was one of the numerous veterans who remained haunted by what he did at My Lai. I just lost all sense of direction and purpose. I just started killing in any way I could. I could kill. It just came. I didn't know. I had it in me. But like I say, after I killed the child, my whole mind just went. It just went. 2 decades after My Lai, in his hometown of Jackson, Mississippi, Simpson sat before a table covered with pill bottles as he told the story of his 10-year-old son, his photo in a frame nearby. The boy was playing in the grandmother's front yard when 2 boys about 14 years old got into an argument across the street. One ran home to get a gun. The other one ran for safety near the spot where Simpson's son was playing. The first teenager returned with the gun and fired at the other teenager, but accidentally shot the child in the head. I was in the house and I came out and picked him up, but he died in my arms. And when I looked at him, his face looked like the same face of a child that I had killed, and I said, this is the punishment for me killing the people that I killed. When asked if this self-torture would ever end, Simpson replied, yeah, when I kill myself, yeah, it'll come to an end. Like I said, I tried suicide 3 times. Simpson succeeded on his 4th attempt, this one in May 1997 at the age of 48. Truon T. Lay's life likewise changed the day in My Lai. That was in 1968. She was having breakfast with her young son, daughter, and 8 other family members when they were ordered outside by American soldiers and taken to a group of other villagers. Squatting or sitting on the main trail into the village, suddenly 2 soldiers raised their rifles and fired into the throng of men, women, and children. Lee dropped to the ground to cover her 6-year-old son. Don't cry, she whispered as 2 bodies fell on them, shielding them from the gunfire. The Americans have shot everyone. Don't cry and see if we can survive. Lee cupped her hands over the boy's mouth and lifted her head to see soldiers pointing here and there while shooting those still alive. In the silence that followed the last shot, she could hear the clicks of a camera as someone took pictures of the scene. End of quote. That book again is My Lai, Vietnam, 1968, and The Descent into Darkness by Howard Jones. Highly recommend this book. As you know from the last episode, I attended a moral injury seminar, and moral injury has always been a particular interest of mine, moral injury as a result of having participated in war. So I want you to reflect on that this Memorial Day weekend, and thank you. So, Storming America, the aftermath. Again, if those of you who have listened to the other 3 episodes in the Storming America series, where we talked about the possibilities, the probabilities, intelligence failures, what it may look like, and in this, where we're going to entertain speculatively, what the aftermath may have looked like, you have to consider that this is going to be something that America probably hasn't seen the likes of as far as a foreign invasion is concerned en masse, as this will probably be since the British invaded the country in 1812 through 1814. As a matter of fact, on August 24th, which happens to be my day and month of birth, in 1814, the British burned down the White House in 1814. By the way, I'm not saying that it's necessary, but I suggest that you listen to this Storming America series in linear fashion if you get the chance. Listen to them in sequence, and maybe you'll get more out of it. But it doesn't mean that this can't be a standalone episode. For those of you who have just listened to a few of my podcasts, or maybe, welcome aboard, you've never listened to any of them, and this is the first one that you're listening to, welcome aboard, and I thank you, and I hope that you, if you like this, leave comments, leave recommendations, leave likes wherever you may find the opportunity to do so, and I appreciate that a lot. What we're going to talk about here is the aftermath of what happens when we're going to put a magic number on this. And this number, again, is entirely speculative. I'm going to talk about the number of 10,000 trigger pullers and bomb throwers, and who would comprise the original gangsters in this jihadist assault on America. The number that I can't put a more precise or even probabilistic number on is Schlichter's assertion, which I have uncomfortably and hesitantly embraced, that many elements of the American left, as it's characterized, whether it be BLM, whether it be Antifa, or in the last 4 months, the campus affiliations with Gaza advocacy and such. Again, hats off to Schlichter. He didn't necessarily predict it, but he sort of rhymed about this. And what he made mention of in his book, The Attack, by Kurt Schlichter, and the other book that we speak to here in this particular series, that's a fictional novella, is by William Fortune, which is called Day of Wrath. And these are both riffs and rhymes on what would happen if we had an upsized October 7th attack, upscaled, here in America that matched what came out of Gaza into Israel over those 24 hours on October 7th. What Schlichter posits is that while not all of the college campus BLM or Antifa or collectivist affiliated elements in America would become triggermen side by side with them, but they would find through spontaneous order and maybe some previous arrangements that they would provide auxiliary support for this jihadist assault on America. Now, as I mentioned before, I am neither, I'm a member of neither party, nor will I ever be. I was for a period of time way back when, but I would not do so now. So these aren't assignations against political bad actors in America. This is simply my speculation about what's going to happen when this occurs, and what has fed this to a very large extent is an unlimited immigration crash across especially the southern borders of America that has let loose millions, maybe even tens of millions of folks who have not only sought asylum, but found their ways through the cracks and sinkholes and unnoticed dark areas of the border to come in here absolutely unmolested by any government entities whatsoever, to include what the NGOs have done to bend the truth a little bit when it comes to these people coming in. And of course, those who are seeking asylum, I have heard that some of them are given a slip of paper when they come across and granted asylum, in which 3, 5, 10 years from that day in which they have their cordial meeting with the CBP, that they have to come to court and declare themselves or do whatever the case may be. How that is enforceable is beyond me. But I think that 3, 5, 10 years, that may be well within the envelope, if not a little longer than I suppose, that the very thing that I've been positing for the last 3 episodes could occur here in America and change the face of it forever. To bring you up to speed, for those of you who haven't listened to the previous episodes, and I'll make this quick for those of you who have actually listened to them, what we're talking about here is jihadist cell structures that are motivated to come to America. They are armed inside the borders and in a cellular structure in let's say, again, speculatively, you have cell leaders who are subordinate to a cellular commander that is over a number of cells. And the very reason that a cellular structure is employed is because the way the West and the U.S. in particular, especially the intelligence community and the law enforcement agencies, hunt, is that they hunt in a way so that they find somebody, and then that one person, if they don't have a cellular structure, they're able to roll up the entire entity or hostile modality before they can do any harm. The purpose of cellular structures is so that they have cutouts. So if you roll up one cell of 5, 10, 15, 20 men, you can't roll up the others because they have no knowledge of the others except for the cutout cellular commander who's in charge of, let's say, 5, 10, 15, 20 cells of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 men. And as I'd mentioned earlier, and again, I'm riffing off of Schlichter and Fortune, what happens is these are fire and forget weapons. They are armed, they are given IEDs, they are given bomb-making materials, they are given bombs, they are given fake IEDs, they are given grenades, they are given stingers, they are given javelins, whatever the case may be. Various cells, depending on where they are located, whether a rural or urban enclave in their targeting for their targeting intelligence packets that they're issued, for that day that they're going to be let loose and fired. We don't know what that's going to be necessarily. I think that the savvy organizer for these kind of events is going to make sure that in an urban area, they're going to have the appropriate tools to cause the urban mayhem that they'll have to. For instance, would they be issued armor in urban areas? Maybe. Maybe not. Would they be issued armor in rural areas if there are rural enclaves that are going to be attacked by these jihadists? Very possibly, because the density of firearms ownership, especially at the atomistic level, at the private level, part of this, thank you, Lucas Botkin of T-Rex Arms, the civilian defense industry, what it's been feeding for years, if not decades now, where we have this very large body of armed people in America, whether they are veterans of the last quarter century of warfare in the Middle East or not, who are very savvy with their weapons, and maybe they even EDC, maybe they every day carry a pistol or whatever the case may be. What that causes for bad actors and malcontents, and what one can classify as jihadist soldiers in this case, that will cause them a lot of grief, especially in the rural areas, where the density and everyday usage of firearms is much higher than it would be in urban enclaves, accepting the law enforcement officials who have them, because you'll find that the bigger the city, San Francisco, L.A., Chicago, New York City, St. Louis, Missouri, places like that, the higher the concentrations of political power in these cities, they tend to concentrate power against the private ownership of firearms, which, as we've reflected with what happened in Israel on October 7th, that lack of atomistic and unfettered access to firearms at the point of the spirit, as it were, caused a whole lot of casualties and deaths in that country that could have been stopped by people who can react instantly to that kind of thing happening. So we're going to play around with some numbers here, and these are simply, again, I say, speculative numbers. For the purpose of calculations that makes things easier, what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that there are 10,000 jihadists. Now, one can say, well, we'll make it 200 per state for 50 states. Well, I don't know if that would work or not, because in Alaska, for instance, which probably would have, even in the cities, one of the highest incidents of unfettered and rather atomistic firearms access for even the normal citizen, because there's a huge gun culture there because of the savage fauna that one will find in Alaska that can make you assume room temperature rather quickly if you don't have the means to stop them, whether it's a bear, it's a moose, a wolf, or whatever the case may be. So maybe they wouldn't assign, because of the lack of potential success factors, as many there, and they would take this 10,000 number and divide it in a fashion where instead of 200 per state, maybe in a state like California or New York or Illinois or Missouri or other states like that, there would be a higher concentration of jihadist cells. These jihadist cells, I would suspect, would be anywhere from 5 to 15. There is a rule in the military and the corporate world that when it comes to delegation, human span of control is about 5 to 8, which is why, let's use simple math here. We're going to call them teams of 10. We're going to say 5 to 8, which means that 5 to 8 teams, which is potentially 50 to 80 packs, personnel, total in these jihadist cells, would be assigned to a cellular section leader who would have control of that to send the fire and forget orders in whatever means they could do, the most secure being, of course, one-time pads. But less secure, but harder to find, would be phone signals that seem banal, but nonetheless they could be a word, much like we had in 1944 on June 6th, when the Maquis and the French resistance were alerted via radio communications and Jetberg teams that the invasion was happening. So those of you who are familiar with the very interesting movie The Longest Day from 1962, which portrayed the events of June 6, 1944, the chair is against the wall. John has a long mustache. It was some kind of variant on that, most likely in English. Would not probably be in an Arabic text, because I'm certain that despite the fact that there appears to be a prohibition on profiling, I think that Arabic language texts in American airspace and communications would probably call attention to itself to the IC, the intelligence community in the United States. So they've launched in the fashion that I described in the episode previous to this one. And as a result of that, now remember, I've used these, again, speculative number of 10,000. What's the casualties going to be here? What are the fatalities? And what are the wounded going to be like in this? So to revisit very quickly what I had talked about previously, what it means is that they're going to be using handguns. They'll be using fully automatic weapons. They'll be using rifles. They'll be using grenades. They'll be using explosives. They'll be using cars. They'll be using V-beds, vehicle IEDs. They'll be using personal IEDs in vests and such. Again, how does one determine what those casualties are going to be? Of course, in high-density population areas where people are packed together much more tightly, in urban areas more than rural, the urban areas will suffer a considerable amount of, I hate using the morbid word body count, but there will be higher casualty rates in the urban areas simply as a result of the chaos avalanches this will create. When people will have accidents, people won't have access to the proper medical care because traffic will be jammed up. For instance, one thing that William Fortune talks about in Day of Wrath is that not only are they targeting elementary schools and middle schools in that particular scenario in his novella, but they're also banking that parents, once they're alerted to what's going on because they're video casting on the internet every kind of awful thing that they're doing at these schools, parents will hop in their vehicles and they will beeline for those. It will cause traffic jams on the arterials, and they have people pre-positioned at the arterials to take advantage of this. Because imagine this. All of us have been on busy highways. There's an accident on a highway. Traffic slows to a crawl, if not a complete stop. How easy would it be for armed folks, especially in cities, because the everyday carry of firearms isn't as common there. How easy would it be for these jihadist cells or cells working together in teams to go along down the road of all these stopped vehicles and start causing all kinds of mayhem? Well, it's going to be huge. These numbers that we're going to see as far as dead and wounded are just going to be enormous. So remember, I said as a result of 10,000 jihadists, most of whom will assume room temperature as a result of either police fire, maybe military fire 24 hours into this, when they start getting hunted and the government finally realizes exactly what is going on contemporaneously and apparently spontaneously across the country, because these are fire and forget weapons, because all of these cells, inspired by a religion that celebrates this very thing, they're all going to assume room temperature or be wounded or be captured. I think very few will be captured. And then what is the casualty count going to be for America? I think it's going to be hundreds of thousands of dead, and possibly millions of injured. Now, those millions of injured will be a result not simply of direct jihadist cell mayhem, destruction in action, but the concomitant mayhem that comes from automobile accidents, ambulances not being able to get people there from the site of the gunshot wound to the hospital in the golden hour necessary to treat that kind of trauma. But Schlichter brings up another point that I find incredibly disturbing, and I am more and more convinced that it is a distinct possibility, especially because of the behavior we've seen on the college campuses in the last 90 to 120 days because of the kerfuffle between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I am not picking a side. I am not saying who is right and who is wrong. I think that to a certain extent, there's a pox on both houses in this particular conflict in the Middle East because of their absolutely abhorrent and barbaric behavior on both sides. It's hard to pick a good guy in a bad fight. But nonetheless, what these college campus protests have shown is that if the jihadists were to harness this animosity towards Israelis and towards American policy, and were not only to take up arms with the jihadists at the same time in either a planned or spontaneous fashion, but to act as auxiliaries in, as Schlichter would posit, clogging up 911 lines with bad calls during this event in the first 24 to 72 hours, providing them with safe houses, providing them with food, water, medical treatment, those kind of things, the jihadist cells, providing them with that. I do think if that were to happen, and if it were satisfied from an evidence perspective in the aftermath of this horrific collision of cultures that I think is now more inevitable than ever before, it will change the face of American collegiate education and also maybe change the face of the investigatory profiles from the federal to the local level and everything in between when it comes to law enforcement and their view of BLM, Antifa, and all of these elements that participate in that kind of thing. History rhymes. It doesn't repeat. And while I would like to say, in this aftermath, what is America and the West going to look like after this happens? Well, there's two paths, of course, and it seems like oversimplification to think that, well, there's simply a bifurcation here. One path goes in one direction, which is bad for American liberty, and that is the marker that I'm going to employ here, and one looks good for American liberty. Now, William Fortune forecasts that, I hate to give you a spoiler here. As a matter of fact, I won't go into specifics, but he forecasts that this is going to be an absolute disaster for American liberty in his book. The cynic in me finds solace in his conclusions. Schlichter comes to the opposite conclusion, where he says that in some miracle of sobriety, good thinking, and good government, I put that in quotes because you'll rarely hear that come out of my mouth, somehow we get out of this fiasco, this invasion, this military operation on American soil, with not only liberty intact, but things get better over time, and it teaches America a lesson possibly, and I don't know if Schlichter would endorse this or not, that, as I have said repeatedly, Newton's third law is a stone-cold motherfucker. And this, what happened in 9/11, 2001, and this, which I think is far more probable than possible, this is the nature of it. This is why it's happening. None of this would happen in the possible, probable future we face unless we had meddled, meddled, meddled with the world for the last 100 years. everything is coming home to roost. That's what's going on here. That's why this is going to happen. I regret that. I don't want it to happen. I don't want any of this to happen. But in Fortune's mind, bad actors in American government will take advantage of this to make America's march into totalitarianism even more comprehensive and rapid than we have seen since the end of World War II. Now, Schlichter, of course, as I mentioned, is a bit more... He's looking at this with rose-colored glasses in my mind. I have the greatest respect for Colonel Schlichter. I enjoyed his other books. I highly recommend his books. He and I may not agree on everything. Now, Bill, your host here, is rather cynical by nature, so I tend to think realistically Fortune's forecast of American totalitarians using this as a device to absolutely throttle and bury American liberty is the likely outcome of this jihadist attack on America. Schlichter's viewpoint is the one that I want to embrace. It's the one that the happy man inside me says, man, make that happen for my children and my grandchildren. Make Schlichter's vision of finally having that voila moment existentially throughout the country where bigger government doesn't necessarily make you safer, doesn't necessarily make you better off, and certainly doesn't advance civilization in the way that most free people and those who cherish liberty would want to happen. So what's going to happen? We're going to handle this in sort of two parts. So in Fortune's vision, again, apologies for the spoiler, highly recommend his novella. It will be just as scintillating and a ripping good yarn to read, even knowing what I've told you about the ending. But nonetheless, what that would mean is that as a result of this, with hundreds of thousands of dead and potentially millions of wounded and casualties, that the government would use this opportunity to shut down unfettered access to weapons, shut down Second Amendment rights, shut down jury trials. As a matter of fact, they could use this as the moment, which they did with the Patriot Act in 2001, moving a step closer to the abyss, to sort of take the Bill of Rights and rip it asunder and say, for safety, and remember, safetyism is the primary means by which all governments advance what they do for a living in depriving men and women of their atomistic liberty. They would say, because this is so dangerous, because what's happened is just so horrific, for your own good, you must surrender your rights, your liberties, so that the government can protect you. Now, what's curious about this is that it would fly in the face of contemporary jurisprudence, and that would have to be fixed immediately. One of the first things that they would have to do is that there's 3 Supreme Court cases per police protection: Castle Rock v. Gonzalez, Warren versus D.C., and DeShaney versus Winnebago County, in which the Supreme Court affirmed that the police are not there to protect you as individual citizens. They have no obligation whatsoever to protect you. Now, from a constitutional or practical standpoint, this makes perfect sense, because if they were to have said the opposite, that the police are to protect you as individuals, then that would mean that every time the police, who primarily are historians, are not there to protect you and you are a subject or a victim of criminal mayhem, they'd be subject to lawsuits because they're not fulfilling their obligations. Now, what this also means is that if this Supreme Court case says, per the police protection in those 3 cases that I just delineated, and I recommend that everybody here listening delve into those cases and read up on it so that you know that this mythos in America, that the police are there to protect you and provide for your safety, it doesn't exist in reality. What it also means is that in Fortune's case, they're going to have to invalidate this. They're going to have to vacate those notions, and they're going to have to say that the police are there to protect you. Now, there's always been an interesting tension here, because if the police per these three cases, has no duty to protect citizens. And if self-same government insists that through 20,000 weapons restriction laws to include the 1934 National Firearms Act, the 1938 Federal Firearms Act, the very curious case of 1939 U.S. v. Miller, the 1968 Gun Control Act, the 1994 McClure-Volkmer Act, and the assault weapons ban for 10 years starting in 2003, the NICS checks, all these things are imposition upon the private ability to defend oneself because the social contract has been sundered from the government where they say, hey, we can't protect you with the police because they have no obligation to do so. And to me, constitutionally and practically speaking, it makes perfect sense why they did this. And they did this from a very practical perspective, as I just delineated. But in that social tension here, if they use all of these means that I just described to impose a privation and severe limitations on your ability to arm yourself, then there's something that is not going to be resolved in a way that will make you safer. In other words, if Fortune's prognostications about a darker turn where the government becomes even more totalitarian quickly and substantively than we've observed in the past 50 years, then that's going to make American liberty become extinguished. Remember what I said in episode 37, Storming America, Another War Will Come Home, where I set and shaped the conditions and the stage for what I was going to discuss about this probable invasion of America. When one examines the attack on Israel out of Gaza on the 7th of October, only 140,000 Israelis out of a population of 9 million, or under 2% if you could do math, were allowed to own a firearm prior to October 7th, and that was restricted to a handgun only, and ammunition was limited to 50 rounds. I'm a gun guy. My entire family is comprised of people of the gun, and you will know, those of you who have been around guns and those who take training seriously and take the profession of arms seriously, 50 rounds per annum is an insufficient amount of ammunition to train and maintain the efficacy, effectiveness, and how you are using weapons systems in a coherent and excellent fashion. It won't be done with those kinds of limitations imposed on you. What one could foreseeably contemplate in the future, if Fortune's notions come to the fore, is the complete eradication of atomistic weapons ownership in America, the complete eradication of what is a limited, unfettered access to firearms. And that in itself would be a perverse incentive for this very awful turn of events that I've been describing now in this fourth episode to come about yet again as a result of the absolute inadequacy, inability, and imbecility of all the government agencies in charge of forecasting, predicting, and preventing these kind of things happening. And when they inevitably happen, protecting these very citizens themselves if they were to impose these totalitarian measures that I'm talking about, which wouldn't simply talk about guns, because what they would say is they'd say, well, we're going to turn off the internet because the internet was a means by which they could broadcast, in this case, the jihadists, their black and white propaganda, which would be videotaping themselves doing horrible things during this day or two or three. So by tamping down the internet and eliminating that, we'll put that to bed. By ensuring that everybody is disarmed, we'll be able to disarm the bad folks. Ask people how the drug war has progressed since 1932-33, when the U.S. Treasury first demonized marijuana and put it on a schedule for prohibition. It doesn't work out that well, because what happens is all black markets fulfill themselves in a way where they get around all of these kind of things. Prohibition of alcohol from 1919 to 1933 when it was sunsetted didn't work out too well as far as stopping that from happening. The same applies here to military, paramilitary action. When one looks at the international theater of nations, what one is seeing is this vast anarchic stage in which no one can necessarily tell other people to do something and get full compliance unless they are doing it at the point of a gun or potential threats. For instance, whatever the Foggy Bottoms crew at the State Department, with their notions of high-minded diplomacy and maybe even neutrality and notions of peaceful conditions being imposed in warlike circumstances, none of that can occur unless you have the armed force to make it stick. So I'm very pessimistic about any of that working in a fashion that would make it so that a totalitarian impulse could prevent those kind of massacres. We can look throughout history, and we can find that even totalitarian nations, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be Cuba, whether it be North Korea, or any number of others throughout history, especially in the 20th century, that totalitarian impulse to prevent harm to their resident populations may turn itself into a weaponized modality where the nation itself, the government itself, that imposed these measures to ensure the safety of their population would use those to start jailing, injuring, or murdering their own citizens, such as the literally hundreds of millions that died at communist hands in communist nations in the 20th century. I am going to hedge my bets and close out Fortune's argument that I think that if Fortune's forecast of an even heavier tyrannical hand imposed by the central government in the United States were to materialize as a result of this jihadist invasion and assault on the American homeland and the American polity, I suspect this would quickly devolve into a civil war. I don't have the notions precisely of what that would look like, but I think that it would become intolerable over a time to a considerable part of the armed nation when they would have to, the government in this case, disarm and confiscate the firearms, ammunition, training implements, body armor of literally tens of millions of Americans. I can imagine that that would lead to some Newtonian reactions for which the central government had not planned. Now let's move to Schlichter's more rosy picture. What Schlichter says is that as a result of this, maybe less meddling overseas to stop that Newtonian construct of reaction. Maybe the military reorients itself to homeland defense along with law enforcement organizations. And you get a sense in reading his book, which is sort of like a World War Z variant in which the interviews are conducted by organizations after the fact, and they're talking to people who actually experienced this attack in America. And one of the things that's considered is, well, whatever it turns out that in the book, and of course this is Schlichter's speculation, everybody in the book carries a firearm because in the end, when it comes to fighting against existential, atomized terroristic threats like the jihad that we've been talking about over the last 4 days in America proper, the only primary way to nip it in the bud immediately when these happen is the atomistic and unfettered access to firearms, as I mentioned, EDC, everyday carry, which would be those people who, at the point of the spear, where these events are occurring, can ameliorate the situation or make it difficult for the malefactors immediately because they're on the scene and not waiting for moments, if not hours, if not days, for police forces, in this case, numbering approximately 1 million, over 19,000 departments in the United States, from the local to the county to the state to the federal level and everything in between, that they would simply be overwhelmed in the first hour or two of responding to these. They would take, the police forces themselves would take casualties. They might be stuck in traffic. They may be forced to go to hospitals and take a considerable amount of their manpower to protect either speculative, probable, or very real places that need to be protected under siege. Could be schools, could be hospitals, could be government buildings, could be any number of things. The only solution set to this, to make this kind of invasion, this kind of event, less harmful to everybody involved, there is no other way to do it than, as I've said, and I sound like a broken record, and I know that, unfettered and atomistic access to firearms. That is the only way. Now, I am open to comments and suggestions from my listeners and readers to let me know where I may be wrong in there. Maybe you have a more efficacious solution set to how we do this, because here's something that we're not going to do. We're not going to eradicate evil on earth. We are not going to eradicate evil in every human heart. We are not going to lessen, reduce, or zero out the contests between tribes planet-wide that has been going on in humanity for years after years, for millennia. This is not going to be solved by talking it through. This is going to be solved by the immediate action against these kind of conflict narratives where, when it occurs, it is put down immediately, whether through injuring or killing the malefactors and the members of these terroristic cells. That is the only way this is going to happen. Now, Schlichter paints a hopeful picture. But I see that even with 2 million recorded DGUs, defensive gun use incidents, in America every year, despite nearly 45,000, if I've seen the latest stats correct, as far as firearms deaths in America, 2/3 of which are suicides, which means that when you reduce it by 2/3, let's do simple math on the air, that means 15,000 minus 2,000 for police encounters. That's 13,000 people dead as a result of firearms. When you take certain demographics and you take certain areas out of the equation, and you look at the rest of the country, for instance, and then you look at that use of defensive gun use, what you discover is that America, despite being, as those who don't like firearms would say, awash in an ocean of rifles and pistols and shotguns, is safer than some European countries. Nonetheless, am I saying that this unfettered access, this atomistic access to firearms would be unregulated, that I'd want untrained people there? Well, as a matter of fact, my predisposition is that you decriminalize it. You don't regulate it. And through decriminalization, what I mean is that the government's not involved in it at all. Should people be trained? They certainly should. I have this notion, and I'm going to give you a thought experiment. It's this. It's the 1930s, and you have FDR. And FDR was probably one of the most awful presidents to inhabit that office, with the amount of degradation and destruction of basic American liberties that occurred during his entire tenure in the awful office. And he says, again, speculatively, food is so important that the government's taking it over. From farm to table and everything in between, a government agency or agencies are going to be in charge of this. Fast forward to today, we all know, except the most jaded collectivist out there, we all know what that would look like. Rotting food, warehouse snafus, food lines, rationing, you name it, all the horrific things that have taken place in communist nations, for instance, that rely on the government for food delivery. And then folks like myself, many of my listeners, many of my readers, many people that I know, friends, family, acquaintances, would say, hey, what if we got the government out of the food business? What if we could have unique, cutesy names like Publix or Kroger or Fry's or something like that? And these would be supermarkets. These would be food markets in which we would allow the free market to compete to provide at different price points qualities and kinds of food, and that we would deregulate farming so that farmers would have their own incentives, in this case free market incentives, to make profits, to deliver food that year by year, if they instantiate reputations for good food, they could prosper, including the transportation nexus, including professional warehousing in the private sector and such. Do you suppose, hypothetically, if we privatized food delivery, in this case, farm to table, and made it even more unfettered and unchained from government regulation, things would improve? I happen to think that they would improve. So with that thought experiment in mind, what has to happen, and I don't know if Schlichter would approve of this or not, but I'm taking it to the next level nonetheless, because this happens to be my podcast and not his, is that I want it to be unregulated, decriminalized, unfettered access to firearms. Now, folks will challenge that and they'll say, but if you do that, criminals will get firearms. Well, they do it now, as I alluded to earlier with the drug war, with alcohol prohibition. Wherever the government seeks to stop something from happening, they inevitably, inexorably create black markets, vast black markets. Even communist countries have black markets. I think, to a certain extent, even the more sober observers of the USSR and other communist countries sort of got a glimpse that there was an almost wink and a nod from communist authorities on the existence of black markets, because they knew that absent those black markets, their regimes would collapse in a fashion that would probably be very accelerated. So they would wink and nod at that. And of course, in the Politburo, in the connected political and even the intelligence organizations, they would probably get a VIG. They would probably get a piece of the action. They would probably, it's the nature of institutionalized corruption. I'm always amused by folks who, having spent time in the third world and developing countries and having spent almost 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, people say, well, they're so corrupt. And I always correct people, and I say, well, they're corrupt. I mean, that's the lubricity and nature of how their power relationships exist in third world and developing countries. I saw it firsthand in Afghanistan. It doesn't mean there's no corruption in the West. The West simply institutionalizes that corruption. Taxation is Exhibit A. So I've offered you two glimpses into the darkness and into what could possibly be a brighter day for everybody, per Schlichter. The darkness being fortune's prognostications. The realist in me thinks fortune is correct. That in the end, when, not if, when this happens, because the perfect storm is here. All the parts and pieces are together and in a fashion coalesced where to me it seems almost inevitable that this, and I'm hoping it's not on as large scale as I have prognosticated, I think it's inevitable this is going to happen. The realist in me says fortune's notions of what's going to happen are more realistic of the reaction by the U.S. federal government than Schlichter's more rose-colored glasses assignation that all of a sudden the federal government will do the Gallic shrug, put their hands in the air and say, man, we've been wrong about this the entire time. We need to allow people to have the means to protect themselves if this ever happens again. I don't see it. I hope for it. I mean, in the military, we had best case scenario, worst case scenario. in this case, the worst case scenario for liberty and freedom, is going to be Fortune's estimate that there will be huge lockdowns. Now, as I mentioned, there's even darker notions to this. I suspect that in the chaos avalanche, in the cavalcade of calamities that would be Fortune's U.S. government reaction in a very totalitarian, heavy-handed fashion against U.S. citizens proper, that it would lead to civil war and unpleasantness in America. So what we have is best case scenario, what Schlichter says, love for that to happen as a realistic observer of human conflict and human events. My money is with Fortune's forecast, and I think what this will do, this probable event of a jihadist cell incursion, invasion, and murderous rampage in America, will result not only in a very heavy-handed central government response, but will inevitably lead to civil war in America. So, those are my thoughts. I'm interested in yours. Provide feedback, comments at my Substack. You'll see some of my book recommendations, as you always do, because remember, as Voltaire said, books make the best furniture. In the show notes on both Substack, and I've been trying to populate those very same show notes in the RSS feed. Any recommendations for improvements in the podcast? Any recommendations for future episodes you'd like to see me entertain? I am all ears. And again, I am so grateful for the feedback and solicitude and support of my modest enterprise here at Chasing Ghost and Irregular Warfare podcast. If you wish to correspond with me, you can find me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. Thanks for listening. This is Bill, out.